This is the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, near modern Luxor. Walk into one of its courtyards and you'll see the famous wall carving. Captives in feathered headdresses presented before the gods. The inscription that describes the foreign conspiracy in their islands. For 2 centuries, scholars have called these invaders the Sea Peoples and assumed those islands were somewhere in the Aegean. But buried inside the same inscriptions and inside surviving correspondence from the doomed kingdom of Ugarit is something stranger. A reference to a place these people came from that doesn't match any island, any coast, any known port. The Egyptians translated it as their isles. The original phrasing describes something else. A refuge beneath the sea, a place reached by descending. Today we're going to decode what the inscriptions actually said, trace the geography, and identify the entrance they used. Hit subscribe. The Egyptian word at the heart of this is iwbu. Standard translations render it as islands, and that is how it appears in nearly every English version of the Medinet Habu inscriptions you will find in a museum or a textbook. But IWW has a wider semantic range than most readers realize. In late Egyptian usage, it covered coastal refuges, hidden places, lands separated from the mainland by water of any kind. It did not have to mean an island in open sea. It could mean a place cut off from ordinary travel. Egyptologists in the 19th and early 20th century defaulted to islands because it fit the dominant theory of the time. The Sea Peoples were assumed to be Aegean migrants, so the IWW became the Aegean. The translation hardened into convention. Later linguists working on the same texts have pushed back. In this specific construction, the term carries a stronger sense of inaccessibility, places the boats cannot find. That phrase isn't speculation. It appears in the great Karnak inscription describing the northerners coming from the lands of the sea, from places the boats cannot find. Read literally, that is not a description of islands. Islands are where boats go. This is something else. This is a description of a refuge that lay outside the reach of ordinary sea travel. The Sea Peoples are described carrying women, children, household goods, livestock. They weren't pirates. They weren't an invasion fleet in the conventional sense. They were a population on the move, fleeing somewhere specific. The question becomes the one the standard reading has never quite answered. Where do you go when you're a Bronze Age people fleeing a collapsing world and the place you describe can't be found by ordinary ships? The most famous correspondence to survive the Bronze Age collapse came from the doomed kingdom of Ugarit on the Syrian coast. King Amurapi's panicked letters to the king of Cyprus, the warning about the 7 enemy ships that had been sighted at sea, the plea for advice that arrived too late. Every history of the Sea Peoples quotes from these letters. But there's one passage that almost never gets the attention it deserves. A Cypriot official wrote to Amurapi after one of the early attacks. He warned that 20 enemy ships earlier left in the mountainous areas had not stayed behind. They left suddenly, the writer said, and we do not know where they are. The standard reading treats this as ships hiding along a rocky coast, sheltering from view. A closer look at the original Akkadian suggests something different. The construction implies the ships entered the mountains, not merely sheltered beside them. And the writer is explicit. The ships left, suddenly, and could not be located. 20 ships do not vanish on an open coast. Sentries see them, fishermen see them. Coastal villages report them. The only way 20 ships disappear from the visible world is if they go somewhere the visible world cannot follow. String. This is not unusual terrain. It's the dominant geology of the entire region, and in antiquity it was treated as sacred. There's a real site that proves the point. The twin sinkholes at Kenet ve Kehanem, near modern Mersin, were known in antiquity as Korykos. The ancient Greeks placed the entrance to the underworld there, claiming the storm monster Typhon was imprisoned beneath the earth at that exact location. The Greeks didn't invent that association, they inherited it. Hittite religious texts from the 2nd millennium BCE already identify the same cave system as a sacred refuge associated with storm gods. The Greeks arrived, found the local population already venerating the site, and absorbed the tradition into their own mythology under new names. The peoples doing that veneration before the Greeks arrived were the same peoples Egyptian sources call the Luca and the Denyen. The place inside the earth wasn't metaphor. It was a specific geological feature with a known entrance, used and named by the Sea Peoples generations before Greece existed. In 2019, a genetic study of skeletons from the Philistine city of Ashkelon confirmed what archaeologists had long suspected. The Philistines, the peleset of the Egyptian inscriptions, carried DNA markers consistent with Southern European and Aegean origins. The study made headlines, and it should have. It was the first hard genetic evidence tying any Sea Peoples group to a specific homeland. But it's worth being precise about what the study showed and what it didn't. It covered the peleset only. One group out of 7 named in the Medinet Habu and Karnak inscriptions. The Luca, the Denyen, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Weshesh, the Shurdan, none of them have a comparable genetic data set. Their origins remain, in archaeological terms, an open question. What recent population genetics work on coastal Anatolian and Cypriot populations does suggest is more interesting than a clean migration story. The haplogroup distributions in modern Cilician communities don't match a simple Aegean import. There's a deep substrate population visible in the data, a group that was already there in the late Bronze Age and that absorbed survivors as the collapse unfolded. The genetic signal looks less like an invasion and more like refugees disappearing into an existing population that knew the local terrain. That's the pattern you would expect if part of the Sea Peoples movement involved people retreating into a place outsiders couldn't follow, and intermarrying with the population that already lived there. The Peleset went to Canaan and became the Philistines. Other groups, the ones whose genetics we still can't read cleanly, went somewhere else. The DNA hasn't told us where yet. The geography may already have answered the question. Return to Medinet Habu, the naval battle scene carved on the exterior north wall of the temple. The standard reading is straightforward. Egyptian forces ambush a Sea Peoples fleet in a delta channel. Ships capsize, the invaders drown. Pharaoh's victory is total. That reading is in every guidebook in Luxor. Look closer at the carving and details start to misalign. The Sea Peoples ships are shown without sails, an unusual choice for vessels supposedly engaged in open water assault. Adjacent panels show captives emerging from openings that don't read clearly as ship hulls. The proportions are wrong. The framing suggests something else. The feathered headdress motif appears repeatedly in association with descending figures, men shown moving downward into something rather than across a battlefield. Egyptologists have flagged these anomalies for decades. The dominant view among specialists now is that the Medinet Habu reliefs are not a documentary record of a single battle. They're a composite, a visual narrative that compresses multiple events from a longer campaign into one wall. Some of the panels almost certainly depict naval engagements. Others appear to show pursuit on land, into terrain that wasn't open coast. The implication runs against the popular version of the story. Pharaoh's campaign against the Sea Peoples didn't end on the water. It continued after the ships were broken, with Egyptian forces chasing survivors into the very places the inscriptions had named: the IWW, the coastal refuges, the swallowing places. The carvings record the moment those survivors went underground. That's why the captives are emerging from openings. That's why the figures are descending. Part of the victory at Medinet Habu wasn't fought at sea or on the beach. Part of it happened underneath both. Bring the threads together. The Korykian cave on the Cilician coast, what the Greeks later called the Cave of Typhon. The cave system extends more than a kilometer underground. It contains a freshwater spring, a feature that mattered enormously to anyone seeking long-term refuge. And it was demonstrably occupied during the late Bronze Age. Pottery sherds matching Cypriot styles and Mycenaean late Helladic IIIC ware have been recovered from its lower chambers. That pottery horizon is the same one associated with the Sea People's migrations. The same ceramics that turn up at Philistine sites in Canaan turn up inside this cave on the southern Anatolian coast. The people who carried that pottery were moving through the region during the exact decades the inscriptions describe. They weren't passing through. They were settling in, at least for a time, in a chamber a kilometer beneath the surface. The Hittite religious texts already named this site as sacred before the collapse. The Greeks arrived later, found the local population venerating the cave, and absorbed the tradition into their own myth as the prison of Typhon, the gate to Tartarus, the entrance to the underworld. The cave didn't become a gateway to the underworld in Greek imagination. It already was one in the imagination of the people who used it. The reason it was forgotten as a Sea People's site is straightforward. By the time Greek mythology absorbed it, the Bronze Age peoples who had taken refuge there were gone. Their language was lost. Their identity collapsed into legend. The entrance remained. The name changed. The story became myth. And the inscription at Medinet Habu, pointing toward this place, kept pointing for 3,000 years. The Sea Peoples were not only invaders, they were refugees, survivors, and at the end of their migration, they were people who knew exactly where to disappear when the world ended. The inscriptions aren't fantasy, and they aren't propaganda. They're a record of a real geography, written by people who had reasons to remember it precisely. The entrance the Sea Peoples used wasn't a gateway to an inner Earth civilization. It was something more interesting. A coastal cave system that served as refuge, sanctuary, an eventual grave for one of the most consequential migrations in ancient history. The Greeks called it the gate to the underworld because they inherited the awe without the context. We have spent 2 centuries debating where the Sea Peoples came from. The better question may be where they went. And the answer, carved into a temple wall and a cave mouth, has been waiting the whole time.